This is certainly the biggest spiritual trap in history. Most people think they are awakening, evolving, recognizing signs, reading about spirituality. But, in fact, they remain stuck exactly where the Archons want them at level 3, the famous level 3 trap. And the scary thing is that almost no one realizes this. Not even experienced seekers, who have been studying Gnostic teachings, meditation, pleroma, and levels of consciousness for years. Jesus knew this, and that's why he revealed something that had never been told to the crowds. There are 7 hidden levels of consciousness, and reaching the 7th is what most threatens the system that controls this world. If you feel like you wake up and fall asleep cyclically, that you have moments of clarity followed by confusion, that you notice advances but return to the same patterns, breathe. None of this means you are making a mistake. On the contrary, this is exactly how the subtle prison built by the Archons works, a network of spiritual distractions designed to keep seekers busy, inspired, but energetically drained. Jesus described this in a symbolic way when he chose Peter, James, and John and took them to a mountain, far from everyone, to reveal the invisible structure that conditions the human soul. There, he showed that there is something much greater than faith, rituals, or beliefs. There is an internal path that goes from common consciousness to monad consciousness, passing through 7 levels that completely transform the perception of the self, the soul, and the world. And when someone approaches the higher levels, especially the 6th and 7th, reality begins to react, synchronicities increase, fears fall to the ground, and a deep feeling emerges that one's entire life is a conscious dream about to be understood. Before we get into this secret map, leave a comment below where you are watching this video. I want to see how far this message is reaching. Now hold on tight. Some truths were not meant to comfort but to awaken. Jesus knew that most people walked through life without realizing that there was something much bigger going on inside them. When he talked about awakening, he was not just referring to faith, but to a deep internal process linked to the 7 levels of consciousness. He described each stage as a step in the return to the divine, a movement that took the human being out of unconsciousness and brought him closer to the pleroma. To many, this sounded poetic, but to the closest disciples, it was a real map. A guide to escaping the influence of the Archons and regaining divine consciousness. When Jesus revealed the levels of consciousness, he did so with a delicacy that seemed simple, but hid an impressive spiritual precision. He spoke of how the human soul moved between states of perception, from automatic life to the state of absolute unity. This teaching was not just theoretical. He showed everyday signs and metaphors to explain how consciousness expanded and how the seeker perceived this expansion. It was almost like a liberation manual, but codified so that only those ready would truly understand. After all, advancing through these levels meant escaping the reincarnation trap. The central point of the revelation was that no one needed to conquer anything, just remove the layers that hid one's nature. Jesus explained that consciousness does not grow, it is revealed. This vision surprised those who expected complicated techniques, as he always pointed to the simple, the direct, the obvious. According to his teachings, the seeker already carried the pneumatic soul within him, and awakening simply meant remembering. Each level was like a curtain being opened, bringing the human being closer to the state in which he himself lived full monad consciousness. When Jesus chose only Peter, James, and John to climb the mountain, it was not out of favoritism, it was due to the preparation of conscience. He knew that those 3 were ready to hear something that could not be said to the masses, something that directly touched the 7 levels of consciousness. The climb in silence was already part of the teaching. Each step symbolized leaving behind the mental noise and the weight of the ego. For many, it was just a walk. For them, it was the beginning of an initiation. And Jesus, with that look that penetrated any defense, guided them with absolute presence. High above, when the wind died down and the world seemed far away, Jesus began to speak in a way they had never heard before. He described the journey of the soul, from unconsciousness to the state of monad consciousness, passing through the traps created by the Archons. For the disciples, it was as if a veil had been lifted suddenly. Everything made sense: the parables, the miracles, the shifts in perception they felt around him. Jesus explained that awakening was not a divine privilege, but a process that anyone could go through, as long as they left behind fear and identification with the spiritual ego. The secret instruction was not a complex ritual, but a change of gaze. Jesus said that, to reach higher levels of consciousness, One must first recognize one's ability to observe everything: thoughts, emotions, identities, without getting confused by any of it. He called this witnessing, the beginning of witness consciousness, which would later become the gateway to levels 4, 5, and beyond. On that mountain, Peter, James, and John not only listened, they felt. And they understood that, from then on, they would see the world with a different depth, like someone who finally perceives the board where the spiritual game takes place. The great truth that Jesus revealed to his disciples is that most humans spend their entire lives confined to the first two levels of consciousness. At level 1, the person lives automatically, reacting to the world without realizing that they have a soul. It's almost like being in a deep dream. At level 2, a slight spiritual curiosity appears, but still dominated by fear, rigid beliefs, and the influence of the Archons. These first levels form the basis of Gnostic cosmology, where consciousness remains dormant and limited. For millions, this is the beginning and also the end. Jesus explained that levels 1 and 2 are not errors, but early stages of the soul's journey. They are like fertile, yet dry, soil, waiting for the first drop of true consciousness. It is at these levels that questions arise such as, who am I? What am I here for? Why do I suffer? And although these questions are powerful, they often go unanswered because the person is still stuck in material identity. The seeker feels the call, but does not know how to interpret it, and thus continues his life believing that awakening is for few, when in fact it is the natural destiny of the pneumatic soul. The most intriguing thing is that, even living at these basic levels, the soul feels, from time to time, brief flashes of expansion. These are small moments of awareness, like when something inexplicable happens or when a deep intuition appears out of nowhere, but, without understanding the 7 levels of consciousness, these signals are lost in the chaos of everyday life. Jesus taught that these glimpses are reminders, little holes in the veil indicating that there is much more beyond the surface. However, without guidance, the person falls asleep again, completing the cycle of life and death without ever touching divine consciousness. Level 3 is, according to Jesus, the most treacherous part of the spiritual journey. Here, the seeker finally awakens to the existence of the soul, begins to study Gnostic teachings, looks for signs, delves into books, courses, videos, and practices. It sounds like advancement and, in a way, it is, but it is also the Archons' favorite region. They created a true golden prison, where the seeker feels like he is evolving, but remains spinning in circles. Is the famous level 3 trap, the most sophisticated trap within the 7 levels of consciousness. The problem with level 3 is that it feeds a type of spiritual ego that is so subtle that the person doesn't even realize they are trapped. She accumulates knowledge, collects techniques, meditates compulsively, and lives seeking mystical experiences as if they were trophies. The feeling of progress is addictive but shallow. Just as the Archons designed to maintain the continuous flow of emotional energy, spiritual louche. This is where many confuse information with transformation and end up believing that they are one step away from awakening, when in fact they are still deeply conditioned by the reincarnation trap. Jesus warned that the danger of level 3 is precisely its beauty. It gives the seeker the illusion of control, the feeling of being special, of having discovered hidden secrets, but behind this glow, consciousness remains tied to the subtle ego, unable to make the leap to true awareness. This stage, the seeker talks about enlightenment, but still reacts to the world as before, feels elevated, but is easily offended, seeks unity, but still sees itself as separate. Therefore, he said that level 3 is the most crowded, a bright hall where thousands arrive, and very few manage to leave. The first signs that someone has begun to leave level 3 do not appear as spiritual fireworks, but as small internal changes that are difficult to explain. The person realizes that they no longer need to prove anything to anyone, not even themselves. The desire to accumulate techniques disappears, giving way to a calm simplicity. She begins to feel that true awareness does not come from effort, but from a silent presence that has always been there, and, curiously, he feels less need to talk about spirituality and more desire to live his own truth. Another very clear sign is the decrease in emotional reactivity. Situations that once affected us deeply now pass like clouds, without leaving a trace. It's not apathy, it's freedom. The person begins to notice that thoughts and emotions arise, but do not need to be believed. This natural distancing marks the beginning of witness consciousness, the state that breaks the dominance of the Archons and completely weakens the spiritual ego. This is when the seeker understands, almost effortlessly, that he is not the character, but the consciousness that observes the character. One of the most profound indicators is the decline in the impulse to seek incessantly. The person no longer feels incomplete. They no longer desperately run after courses and answers. She begins to trust her own silence, her inner guidance. The natural intelligence of the pneumatic soul, synchronicities increase because life stops being a labyrinth and begins to function as a dialogue. And, at that point, the seeker is no longer at level 3 not because he went up, but because he stopped identifying with what kept him trapped. Movement is now natural, fluid, inevitable. The call to level 4 does not come as a heavenly voice, but as an intimate feeling that something inside you already knows the way. It is almost as if the pneumatic soul itself begins to pull you out of the confusion of level 3. The person realizes that it is no longer possible to continue identifying with old thoughts, emotions, and stories. A gentle clarity emerges, a silent invitation saying, "Behold." This calling does not pressure, he attracts. It is the gateway to witness consciousness. This movement is so natural that many people don't even realize it has started. Suddenly, they find themselves watching their own thoughts like watching a movie. The same mind that once seemed like a hurricane is now seen as a stream of temporary images. Jesus taught that this change was the true beginning of awakening, because it breaks the Archons' hold on perception. At level 4, consciousness begins to expand effortlessly, preparing the seeker to experience previously inaccessible levels of consciousness. Another aspect of the inner calling is the emergence of unexpected peace, even in the midst of chaos. You realize that something inside you remains untouched, regardless of external circumstances. It is a profound, non-intellectual recognition of one's own conscious nature. This state causes the seeker to begin to notice signs of Gnostic cosmology working in one's own life synchronicities, clear intuitions, a sense of alignment with the soul's mission. And, at that moment, level 4 stops being a theory and starts to become a living experience. At level 4, the first big revelation is realizing that you were never your thoughts. It's as if, after years of believing yourself to be the character, you finally find the viewer sitting in the audience. This shift is subtle but transformative. Instead of fighting emotions or trying to control them, you simply observe them. This simple shift in perspective breaks much of the Archon's dominance, because it weakens the spiritual ego that sustains the level 3 trap. Here the witness consciousness begins to shine. Another essential feature of level 4 is the feeling of internal space. The person discovers that they can feel sadness without becoming sad, that they can feel anger without acting on it. This space creates a freedom that, until then, seemed unattainable. Life keeps happening, but something inside remains stable, silent, and lucid. It is the real beginning of witness consciousness, the point at which the seeker realizes that awareness does not need to be created. It was already there all along, just obscured by previous identifications. At level 4, spontaneous compassion also appears. Not that emotional compassion that fluctuates, but a natural compassion, derived from the clarity that everyone is stuck at different levels of consciousness. This understanding dissolves judgments and reinforces the sense of unity with everything. It is here that one begins to tap into what Jesus called true Visayona perception that sees not just appearances, but the pneumatic soul behind every being. This lucidity paves the way for the natural transition towards level 5, where the separation begins to unravel. At level 5, something extraordinary begins to happen. The sense of self and other weakens. One realizes, not as a concept but as a direct experience, that everything is deeply interconnected. It's no longer just studying Gnostic teachings or talking about unity, it's living unity. Here, the boundary between the observer and the observed dissolves, and a peace emerges that does not depend on circumstances. This natural expansion is a step beyond witness consciousness, revealing deeper levels of awareness. A striking characteristic of this level is the change in the way the person views conflicts and challenges. Instead of resisting or fighting what happens, she understands that each event is part of a continuous flow of divine intelligence. Life stops being a battlefield and becomes a dialogue with divine consciousness. It is at this stage that the seeker begins to recognize that the universe is not chaotic, but driven by a subtle coherence. This understanding completely weakens fear and reinforces the feeling of constant clarity. At level 5, personal energy changes so much that it is common for other people to notice something different, even without knowing how to explain it. The presence becomes lighter, calmer, almost magnetic. The person no longer needs to look for signs, because life itself becomes a field of continuous synchronicity. This is the stage that Jesus described as being one with the Father, a foreshadowing of monad consciousness. Here, the seeker begins to walk naturally towards level 6, as if following a gentle current leading to even deeper waters. At level 6, consciousness enters territory so deep that words begin to fail. Here, the seeker touches monad consciousness, a state in which the feeling of unity ceases to be perception and becomes identity. It is no longer I feel unity, but I am unity itself. At this level, the boundaries of time begin to dissolve, and the soul accesses subtle memories about its origin, its nature, and its mission. Jesus said that this was the point at which a person began to remember who they really are. The memory of the soul's mission does not appear as a ready-made phrase or as a fixed destination, but as an internal recognition of the natural direction of life. The person no longer needs to look for signs, because everything they do comes from a spontaneous coherence between intention and consciousness. It is as if the seeker finally aligns with his pneumatic soul, leaving behind any trace of confusion. This state of profound clarity dissolves the fear of death once and for all, because the person intuitively understands Gnostic cosmology and the functioning of existence beyond the body. Another striking aspect of level 6 is the absence of spiritual effort. There are no more attempts to meditate, correct thoughts, or raise vibrations. Life itself becomes practice, and each daily act reflects the wisdom of the pleroma flowing through consciousness. It is here that the seeker realizes with full force how trapped he was in the level 3 trap, believing that evolution was an accumulation of techniques. Now, he just is. And this silent, luminous, full state naturally paves the way to level 7, the rarest stage of the human journey. At level 7, there is no more journey, no more seeker, and not even the feeling of awakening. Everything is integrated into a state of plenitude so absolute that the very notion of levels loses its meaning. It is here that consciousness returns to its point of origin, the full expression of monad consciousness manifested in the world. Jesus operated from exactly this place, not as someone separate from the divine, but as the divine recognizing itself in human form. It is the pinnacle of spiritual expansion. At this level, the seeker not only understands unity, he lives it in every gesture. There is no resistance to life, because life and consciousness are perceived as one thing. Personal identity dissolves completely, giving way to a simple, spontaneous, and effortless presence. Everything is seen through the lens of divine consciousness, and love is no longer a feeling, but the very fabric of reality. This stage is described by Gnostics as total reintegration into the pleroma. Another characteristic of level 7 is the total absence of fear, especially the fear of death. The person realizes that he was never born and will never die, because what he is cannot be destroyed. Here, there is no longer karma, there is no longer psychological prison, there is no longer the reincarnation trap mechanism, as there is no one to be arrested. The seeker becomes the path itself, the silence itself, the light itself. It's a very rare state, but totally possible for a ready soul, and that's precisely what the Archons fear most. The Archons' greatest weapon has never been fear, but the illusion of evolution. At level 3, they offer the seeker a sweet sense of spiritual advancement, creating an identity based on knowledge, practices, and rituals. The person begins to feel different, special, elevated, and it is exactly this feeling that holds them back. This subtle ego is so seductive that many spend their entire lives defending their beliefs as if they were absolute truths. It is the perfect disguise for spiritual prison. Another powerful mechanism is infinite search. The seeker feels that something is always missing, that he needs one more book, one more course, one more technique, one more meditation to finally get there. But there never arrives, because this constant movement generates the emotional luash that fuels the Archons. They transform spirituality into a race, awakening into an unattainable goal. And as this happens, the person moves further and further away from the simple awareness that would take them to level 4 effortlessly. The most subtle of all deceptions is to believe that awakening depends on accumulating things: knowledge, virtues, vibrations, practices. Jesus warned that this type of spiritual identity was the most difficult to undo, because it seems noble, but it is rooted in the ego. The seeker sees himself as someone on a mission, but remains stuck in the level 3 trap, unable to recognize that the search itself has become the obstacle. It's like running on a treadmill believing you're moving forward, and the Archons know exactly how to keep that illusion going. Spiritual louche is one of the least understood dynamics by seekers, and that is precisely why it is so efficient for Archons. It is generated when a person alternates between spiritual enthusiasm and frustration, an endless cycle of hope and discouragement. The more a person strives to evolve, the more emotional energy they produce, and this energy is exactly the food that keeps the prison of the 7 levels of consciousness functioning. At level 3, this mechanism works at maximum. The seeker feels spikes of motivation after a reading, a video, or intense practice, but soon after sinks into the feeling that it's still not enough. This emotional roller coaster creates a perfect vibrational charge for Archons. They have no interest in the person suffering too much, nor in waking up once and for all. They want them to stay in this intermediate cycle, generating constant louche. It's like a battery that never fully discharges, but also never reaches the fullness of witness consciousness. Jesus warned that true awakening does not have ups and downs, it is silent, stable, continuous. When the seeker begins to notice this repetitive emotional pattern, something within him gently revolts. A clear intuition emerges that this game is rigged, that there is something behind the feeling of almost there. This moment is precious because it indicates that the soul is beginning to break through the veil and see the mechanism. And when the louche stops being produced, the Archon's hold on the seeker begins to crumble. Jesus taught that the jump from level 3 to level 4 does not happen through techniques, accumulation of knowledge, or extreme effort. It occurs in a single instant of recognition, a moment in which the seeker realizes that it has always been consciousness that observes. It is a simple, direct, almost obvious awakening, but one that was covered by the noise of the spiritual search. When this clarity emerges, the entire structure of the level 3 trap begins to fall apart. The person does not need to do, she just sees. This instantaneous realization is so powerful that many feel as if a weight of years has been lifted from their shoulders. There is no more internal struggle, just a deep relaxation towards what has always been there. Spiritual practice, which previously seemed necessary, becomes natural and spontaneous. The mind tries to understand what happened, but cannot, because this leap does not belong to the intellect, it belongs to consciousness. And it is here that the seeker truly begins to experience freedom beyond the domain of the Archons. The curious thing is that although the jump is simple, it rarely occurs while the person is trying too hard. Jesus said that recognition flourishes when the search is unleashed, when the seeker allows the truth to reveal itself. It's like trying to see the moon's reflection in choppy water, the surface needs to calm down on its own. When this happens, level 4 appears as a natural state, not an achievement. That is the beauty of witness consciousness. It is not achieved, it is remembered. Jesus taught that the key to crossing level 3 and stabilizing at level 4 was a simple, almost unpretentious question: what is conscious of this? This question acts like a blade, instantly cutting off identification with internal thoughts, emotions, and narratives. When something bothers you, when the mind is agitated, or when a spiritual doubt arises, this question reveals who the observer is behind the experience. It is a direct return to witness consciousness, a shortcut to the truth that does not depend on effort. By asking this question, one shifts attention from the story to the consciousness that perceives the story. It's like turning the camera to the person filming. The emotion may still be there, the thought may still arise, but the identification with them dissolves. This method was so powerful that Jesus passed it on only to those who were ready to actually use it, because it dismantles the level 3 trap too quickly for those who insist on the infinite search. Asking what is conscious of this? It opens up a clarity that cannot be manipulated by Archons. With the practice of this recognition, the seeker begins to notice something profound. No matter what happens, there is always a silent, conscious space behind it all. This space does not judge, does not react, is not disturbed. He just sees. And it is exactly this seeing that Jesus pointed out as the path to higher levels of the 7 levels of consciousness. When this question becomes natural, almost automatic, your entire life changes, not because problems disappear, but because you discover who is really living in each moment. Stabilizing at level 4 does not mean remaining in constant meditation, but returning repeatedly to the simple recognition, I am the observing consciousness. Each time the person remembers this, they weaken the old level 3 conditioning a little more. The repetition of this self-recognition creates such a deep familiarity with witness consciousness that, little by little, identification with thoughts naturally dissolves. It's like strengthening a muscle that has always existed, but was never used on purpose. Over time, the seeker realizes that he no longer needs to go back to level 4, because it becomes the default state. Thoughts come and go without causing turbulence, emotions pass like gentle waves, and even everyday challenges become lighter. This process is not about trying to stay awake, but about continually relaxing into what is already awake. Jesus said that this silent repetition dissolved the last vestiges of the level 3 trap, because nothing that is observed can control the observer. Conscience remains free. Stabilization also brings a change in the way a person lives their spirituality. She stops looking for extraordinary experiences and begins to value what is simple and authentic. Life itself becomes a practice, and each moment becomes an invitation to recognize the divine consciousness present in everything. When self-recognition becomes natural, there is no longer a risk of significant regression, because the seeker has discovered an internal portal that never closes. From here, movement towards levels 5, 6, and 7 flows effortlessly. Jesus explained that once stabilized at level 4, the spiritual journey stops being a climb and becomes a gentle glide. There are no advanced techniques, no secret steps, no heroic effort. Progression to levels 5, 6, and 7 happens naturally as the seeker releases identifications, beliefs, fears, and internal stories. Instead of fighting to evolve, he allows his awareness to expand. This deep relaxation dismantles the last fertile ground of the Archons. At level 4, consciousness learns not to resist. At level 5, it dissolves into unity. At level 6, she remembers her monadic origin. And at level 7, it integrates everything back into the pleroma. This movement is not linear, but organic, like a river flowing to the sea. The seeker does not need to push the water, just removes the stones. This is the beauty of the natural progression of the 7 levels of consciousness. When a person stops trying to control the journey leads spontaneously. Releasing identifications is the central point of this process. Each layer that falls away, whether it's an old belief, a nagging fear, or a spiritual identity, makes room for greater expansion. The person realizes that they don't need to cling to anything, because nothing defines who they really are. Consciousness becomes light, fluid, formless. And it is this lightness that allows entry into the highest levels, where monad consciousness begins to shine unequivocally. When there is no more effort left, all that remains is to be. As the seeker approaches level 7, life begins to reorganize itself in subtle but unmistakable ways. Synchronicities become so frequent that they stop being coincidences and start to seem like direct conversations with the universe. Small everyday events begin to carry mathematical precision, as if divine consciousness itself were guiding each step. This invisible dance is one of the first signs that consciousness is surpassing the limits of level 6. Another profound indicator is the almost complete absence of fear of death. Not because the person has become courageous, but because they intuitively realize that what they really are cannot die. This understanding is not born from books or beliefs, it is born from direct gnosis, an inner vision that reveals the structure of existence. One understands Gnostic cosmology not as a theory, but as a living experience. Death stops being an enemy and becomes just a change of state, like waking up from a dream. Furthermore, a spontaneous clarity about the nature of things begins to emerge. Old questions dissolve before they are even asked. The mind loses its former domain, because the seeker accesses knowledge that does not pass through thought. It is as if monad consciousness begins to radiate through the human form, illuminating every corner of the experience. This silent, steady, and profound recognition is the harbinger that level 7 is very closure state where everything is seen as it really is. As the seeker advances through the higher levels of consciousness, something curious begins to happen. Specific people begin to appear on their path, almost as if they were sent by life itself. These encounters are not common, they are recognitions. When two pneumatic souls meet, there is an immediate feeling of familiarity, as if they had already walked together in another existence. Jesus said that these encounters were clear signs that the seeker was aligning himself with divine awareness and overcoming the influence of the Archons. These connections are different from ordinary friendships. They have depth, silence, and a mutual understanding that needs no explanation. Simple conversations reveal deep insights, and even moments of silence carry wisdom. These encounters help to dissolve the last remaining doubts, because they show the seeker that he is not alone. There are others crossing the 7 levels of consciousness and awakening to the same truth. It's as if the journey itself begins to be reflected through other people. Many of these encounters also function as catalysts. The presence of another tire accelerates the internal process, like 2 embers that ignite each other. It is not necessary to exchange techniques, practices, or theories, just be together. The shared vibration strengthens the awareness field, making it easier to stay at level 4 and advance towards higher levels. When these encounters begin to happen frequently, it is an unmistakable sign that level 7 is approaching, because collective awakening always precedes full individual awakening. When the seeker approaches level 7, the perception of reality changes in such a profound way that it is difficult to put into words. Life begins to seem less rigid, less solid, almost as if everything were part of a lucid dream. It's not fantasy, it's clarity. A person realizes that thoughts, events, and even external circumstances respond directly to his internal state. Jesus described this point as seeing the world with awakened eyes, where each experience is seen from the monad consciousness and no longer from the ego. This perception completely transforms the relationship with everyday life. Problems no longer seem like threats and start to be seen as symbols, messages, reflections of one's own awareness. The seeker feels that life is talking to him all the time, revealing patterns and synchronicities so precisely that it would be impossible to attribute it to chance. Archons lose almost all power at this stage, because their illusions only work when the person believes that reality is rigid, fixed, and external. Here, everything is recognized as a movement of consciousness. Another striking effect is lightness. One feels as if one is walking within a conscious dream, where every action is intuitive and every choice seems guided by a subtle intelligence. There is no more rush, no more fear, no more effort. Perceiving the world as a dream does not distance a person from life. On the contrary, it makes everything more alive, more real, more meaningful. It is the prelude to level 7, because only someone very close to this state can realize that the world is not a prison, but a mirror. When the seeker gets so close to level 7 that he can feel it as a silent presence within him, something inevitable happens. The monad begins to call. It's not a voice, it's not a vision, it's not an explosive mystical experience. It's a soft, almost familiar recognition, like meeting someone who has always been there. Jesus said that this call is inevitable, because the soul cannot ignore the place from which it came. The complete journey of the 7 levels of consciousness points towards this return. This call awakens a quiet courage. The person feels that they no longer need to protect themselves, control, or understand everything. She realizes that her entire life has been preparation for this very moment, the moment when the soul is ready to dissolve the last layers of separation. Here, the seeker no longer asks for signs, it becomes the sign. And that is why Jesus taught that there is a symbolic phrase capable of aligning the soul with the deepest truth: I am ready for level 7. Not as a request, but as a declaration. When this phrase is said sincerely, something opens internally. There are no fireworks, but there is a luminous clarity, a sense of return, a peace that is not dependent on anything external. It is the heart recognizing its own divine consciousness. This declaration seals the internal commitment to abandon the illusions of the Archons and walk firmly towards the pleroma. From here, the seeker is no longer heading toward level 7. Level 7 is coming toward him. If you've come this far, you've already realized that this journey is not about accumulating knowledge, but about recognizing who you really are. This entire path through the levels of consciousness that Jesus revealed points to a single destination: the memory of your true nature. The question now is not can I do it, but how much am I willing to let go to allow this to happen? Because the truth is simple: monad is already calling, and you already feel this call within you. So, before continuing with your day, pause and reflect. What was the part of this journey that touched you the most? Which level do you feel you are at today? Your answer might be exactly what someone else needs to read to spark something inside them. This exchange is part of the process. It is a way of recognizing ourselves as seekers walking the same path, each at our own pace, but united by the same intention of consciousness. Now I want to hear from you. What surprised you most about this revelation of the 7 levels? Do you feel like you're ready to say I'm ready for level 7? Write in the comments, your voice matters here, and of course, before you leave, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every week we will delve deeper into mysteries, hidden teachings and spiritual secrets that were left for those who are truly ready to see beyond the veil. The journey doesn't end here, she's just getting started.